The great Yogi Berra was famous for saying baseball is 90% mental. The other half is physical. Now, while that brings a smile to our face, he may have actually been onto something that applies to each of us across the spectrum of pursuits. We all look to bring the very best version of ourselves as we step up to the plate each day across whatever is important to us, our personal, professional, or even athletic pursuits. And today's guest, best-selling author, elite athlete, and coach Steve Magness will provide the insights we need to bolster that 90% mental in with Yogi's other half of the equation. Steve is one of an incredibly short list of returning guests over our 350 plus episodes for a reason. Your toolbox to bolster your own life, or that of your clients, will no doubt be filled to overflowing at the conclusion of Steve's time with us today. If this is your first time joining us, I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching. I'm grateful to have you join us in discovering practical, evidence-based strategies to enhance our health, wellness, and performance in the midst of all the noise bantered about by influencers and click-seeking headlines. Now, for the first time ever, we're doing something a little different today, splitting this episode into 2 sessions due to the depth of the content. I mentioned to Steve that from his books, our previous conversations, and the insights he shares elsewhere, that I sometimes feel like we're brothers from another mother. So today, my brother agreed to extend our time together to let this conversation flow. The second half of our conversation will be released in the next episode. On the coaching front, if you're looking to earn your MBHWSC approved coach certification, the Catalyst Coaching Institute was honored to be named the nation's #1 program by Fortune magazine and the most customizable by Forbes. Registration for the next cohort launch is available right now at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Or please, we're always happy to chat with you about details, answer questions, help you talk through how does this fit with my career, that kind of thing. Email is results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com, and we'll set up a time to talk through anything you've got. And now, it's time to win the inside game with Steve Magness on the latest episode of the Coaching Lab podcast. Steve, it's so good to have you back. As I've said in the introduction, we rarely have guests back. Actually, you and your co-author are 2 of the rarities, Brad Stolberg on some of your other books. So welcome back. Good to see you.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be here and can't wait to have this conversation, Brad.
Our son was over. He's got 2 kids now, and he was over yesterday, and we were talking about some different things. And I said, you know what? I'm talking to Steve tomorrow, but about his new book, but my favorite one is, and I was looking through my bookshelf for the Do Hard Things, your most recent one before that, and I realized I think I've got them all. Does this cover it?
You got them all. You're one of the few. Super fan. I love it.
Exactly. Well, you've done. I think I told you in the email. It feels like you're my younger brother from another mother. Everything you have on X, your books, it just resonates, and I hope your readers feel the same, because it's such valuable information, and you don't bore us with research. You don't just go the personal route. You have that wonderful integration of here's a story, but here's the research. Here's the evidence that backs that up. So you and when you write with Brad, both do a great job of that. Thank you. Keep it up. I love promoting your stuff because this is so important to what's happening out there.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because that has been like the crux of my existence since probably, undergrad. Yeah. Because like I've always, my way back in the day, running was all that I cared about. Sure. But I always struggled with this, like, I'd read this research, but then I'd be like, is that exactly how I feel out on the run? Right. Maybe not. Right. Like maybe this doesn't practice. So I'm always trying to blend that practice, that research, not go too far in one direction and forget the other. And I think that's like the art of coaching that I learned long ago as a runner, and I try and apply it to everything now.
And it's what we discover as athletes, as writers, that the research is so important, and yet it's usually slightly behind. And so it's mixing the N of one with the meta-analysis and trying to pull the value from both of those. Well, let's jump in. I got a huge list of questions. There's no way we're going to get through it all. I loved your book, Win the Inside Game. You kicked that book off by noting this idea of survival mode and how we're settling for, in quotes, busy, distracted work. And this kind of hit home, unfortunately, to eliminate the negative feelings rather than solving the actual problem. Like, seriously, we're so busy. How you doing? Oh, I'm busy. Well, don't ask me why, because it's I'm trying to avoid something else. Why is that our default mode? And are there some practical ways we can bring in the focus side that will help us address what we're actually trying to take on in our lives?
Yeah, I think it is our default mode for a couple different reasons. First, I think it's a little in our biology, in the sense that, way back in the day when we're out on the savannah or whatever have you, like survival is all that mattered. So it was better to, freak out over the, rustle in the grass. And even if it was nothing, it was better to overreact just in case it was a snake or lion or tiger or whatever it has. So we're kind of primed to, when we have that feeling, that anxiety or what have you, is like latch onto that and figure out how to solve that thing as quickly as possible, because we're trying to see, is it a snake in the grass or is it just the wind? We have to focus. So our mind gets locked in on that. So we have a little of this like biological priming. And then on the other side, I think what happens is we just live in a world and a time that exploits that. Whether we look at social media, whether we look at TV, whether we look at, I think in general, our information consumption, like rightfully so, it kind of pushes us to kind of live in that survival mode and feed us, those quick hits of fear, anxiety to kind of get us to pay attention. And I think part of the impetus for this book was to say, okay, like everyone's pretty much experiencing this. What can we do about it, given the constraints? And that's kind of the journey I went on.
And I'll just say, I'll personalize it instead of saying people or generally or the population. I'm pretty productive, and yet I catch myself constantly allowing myself to get pulled into stupid stuff and pulled away from the things that really matter, the meaningful, impactful drivers that I feel like I'm on this earth to do. So I've got the vision, and even with that, I get pulled, and I don't know. Again, I've got some things I'm fiddling with, but any tips that you found for yourself, especially with 5 books in 10 years, man? I mean, you're putting it out there. It's working. Whatever you're doing, tell us.
Yeah, but I'm the same way. I think this is where it's like the Instagramification of life, right? Is you see 5 books in 10 years and you think, oh, Steve's got it figured out. No. There are days where I stare at the screen and I'm like, I should write this chapter. And instead, I'm fiddling with, God knows what pops up on my computer screen or phone. And that's just part of it. I think if I was to, simplify some suggestions for your audience, it's this. It's accept that it's going to happen. I think, again, coming back to our modern environment is designed to, essentially distract and pull us away. Right. Except that, like, we're going to fall for it at times. That's just it. And then the second part, and I talk about this in the book quite a bit, is that I don't think we give enough credence to how much our environment invites action. So we know this from an athletic standpoint. Right? If I was to go to a race with you, Brad, like chances are you've got a specific routine.
Exactly.
You know your jersey you're going to wear, your shoes you're going to wear, where you keep them, all of this stuff to get prepared. And all of those things signal to you, it's go time, right? You get on the starting line and you look down at your racing shoes, which are different from your normal trainers, and you got your watch and you got your jersey on, and everything is signaling like, forget everything else in the world. Like, for the next however many minutes, this is the task at hand. And I think we do a really poor job of that in the rest of our life. We don't use our environment, which we know some fascinating science and psychology that tells us that, like, our environment kind of tells us what roles to play or what roles to encompass. And the example I like to use here is, when you go to church, you automatically act a different way than when you're maybe sitting on the couch watching the Sunday football games afterwards.
Right.
You use different words, you use different mannerisms, you'll dress differently. And it's not intentionally you trying to be like, two different people. It's that the environment invites someone who's like, I'm going to be more respectful. I'm not going to use maybe foul language or what have you.
No chips and dip.
Yeah, no chips and dip. That's what you're doing, And then you go to the other environment, invite something else. And I think we can use that concept for our work to signal, okay, who do I want to be when I sit down at the desk? Do I want to be, creative Steve, where I can kind of connect ideas? Do I want to be just like focused Steve, where it's like, hey, I'm just want to write this next chapter? Or do I want to be kind of like diligent, productive worker bee, where it's like, hey, I might not want to do it, but for the next 30 minutes, I got to sit down and reply to all of these emails that are, building up in my inbox like they are for everyone.
Right. Now, I love that. I think you're onto something, that pick your shoes based on the path that you're about to go on. You quote Dr. Snell about 4 keys to a meaningful life. The words are coherent, significant, directed, and belonging. I wrote in the margin of your book, so simple, yet rarely seen. Could you briefly walk us through each of those and maybe some ideas on how to integrate them into our lives? And don't step into your be, do, belong yet, because we're going to hit that next. So can you walk us through some of the practical elements of her 4 aspects?
Yeah, I love this when I came across, because it is simple, but it's something that we don't apply. But if you look at a lot of the research, it shows that if you fulfill these 4 things, you generally, are a happier, healthier, more productive person. They're kind of like the basic psychological needs. And we can argue over, which is best, whatever have you. But I love these 4. And to break it down, is coherence is that our past, present, and future make sense. It's that, we can make sense of Steve of 5 years ago and how I got to this point and where I'm looking to go. It's a story that adds up. If our story doesn't add up, we feel, discombobulated. We feel anxious. We feel, that angst, because it's like, how did we get here and where are we going? Significance is about feeling like you have some sort of status, like what you're doing matters. There is meaning and purpose to your life, and it's impactful. And I think, again, here, if we look at modern world versus ancient world, you can start to see why we struggle with this. Because way back in the day, what was it? It's even not way back in the day, 100 years ago. Exactly. What was it? Exactly. Your local community, your family. Chances are you could find something where you can contribute. Maybe you're the best cook on the block or the best caretaker, the blacksmith, et cetera. And now I think it's really hard because we're not playing a local game, we're playing a global game. And it's way harder to compete and find significance when everybody else, you can always find something doing the same thing you're doing and doing it pretty well. And that kind of makes us feel bad. And then direction is that future piece. It's seeing a path, that there is hope. And I think hope is the right word, because it's so powerful. Because if you look at the research, and I talked about this in Do Hard Things, is that one of the keys to being persistent, to having that toughness, is seeing a future. If we don't see a future, if we don't have hope, we just kind of give up.
Sure, absolutely.
And we can see this again. I love using running example, but if all of a sudden all your goals are out the window, you can't place this high, you can't run your PR, you can't execute well, what happens? It feels like fatigue takes over and you just start slowing down no matter what, because you've lost hope of achieving those goals. And the last one, which is self-explanatory, but I think probably, what I think is one of the most important in today's world is the sense of belonging. Because even though we're hyper connected, even though we can, again, connect with anybody and anyone at any point, what happens is like we don't feel that genuine, connection, that genuine belonging. We're kind of, I called it in the book, intimate strangers. We know people, but we don't hang out as much. And, you've been around the world a little bit longer than me, but I've been around for a long time. And you can think back to your childhood, your early adulthood, and chances are there was probably more hanging out, more like local community things and events and people who, you felt a part of than it is now. Because again, the world makes it really hard to find that community. And when we don't have that community, loneliness and associated, things is a very big contributor to not only anxiety and angst, but also larger mental health problems.
So much to unpack with those four, but I want to jump forward to a question I was going to ask you later. Late in the book, you talk about this concept of identity fusion and your phraseology of connection without fusing. Oh, you nailed it with that. Talk us through that. I'm getting, this is like confession hour with Steve. We moved to Fort Collins about 3 years ago, Fort Collins, Colorado, where Colorado State University is. And I did my undergrad here. And never really did a bunch of games, that kind of stuff. But Suzanne and I jumped into that when we got here. And I found myself fusing to the Rams. And by the way, we're not very good. Next year we will be. But we've historically not been that good. So it's not like I'm picking a top 5 team to be like, yeah, we're good at them. But I was fused with them to the point where when they played poorly, one night I'm sitting out on the deck looking out. And dude, I have a good life. My kids are amazing. We have grandkids. I'm passionately in love with my wife. We get to do some fun things. And yet, because we lost a silly game, so that was a wake-up call for me. But I'm glad it happened. I was like, okay, we're going to enjoy the games, but we're not, like, it doesn't matter, Brad. And it was it was a good moment for me. But how do we do that? How do we recognize that without hitting the wall like that and avoid this fusion thing? Because it's everywhere. We just came through the election cycle. It's really there, but it's there with diets. It's there with certain run training programs. It's there with you should do this versus, it's ridiculous. And again, you're a great follow on X. You do your best to flex some of those things with people. But talk us through how do you avoid the fusion while pursuing the connection, the belonging?
This was one of my favorite chapters to write because it's so fascinating. I think your example in sports is perfect because people understand that. Sports teams often cause us, it's the Yankees, Red Sox.
Yeah. It's a game.
Like you live and die by it, and your entire mood can change.
Yes.
Based on in professional sports, how a bunch of millionaires, play versus a bunch of other millionaires. Right. And I get it. I'm a sports guy. Right. I love sports. But what happens is, and the research is fascinating on this, is we kind of fuse with the group. We tie our sense of self to how the group or, people are doing. And when they become intertwined, we go on that roller coaster with them. Right. And you ask, how do you identify that? I think step one is understanding the feeling and sensations you get when something happens to that group. So in the sports example, if it ruins your day when the Rams or the Yankees or whoever lose, that's a sign. it's okay to be upset at like, oh, my team lost.
Right.
This sucks.
Totally.
But if it is like, overwhelming you, that is a sign that your identity is probably too intertwined with us. The way I like to kind of get at this is it's okay to like something, maybe even love something, but you don't want to marry it, because the person you want to marry, your wife, significant other, spouse who's going to be there and support you. You don't want to marry the sports team, the politician, the diet, or what have you. And the reason is pretty simple: is when we marry that thing, when we marry something, we intertwine with it so deeply, but that it's like the religious saying,
yep.
Two becomes one.
Yep.
Right. And that's fine when you're married to a partner. Mm-hmm. You expect that. You support one another. You have those conversations. But when we marry to a diet, a political tribe, a sports team, whatever have you, what happens is we don't have that back and forth dialogue. So you end up essentially handing over part of yourself and your emotional regulation to however that group does. And it's fascinating because there's research that shows, and I talked about this in the book a little bit, is there's research that shows that after you've kind of fused with the group, your individual decision-making goes out the window.
Yes.
If that group goes 100% the other way, you're going to go the other way. And my example in sports is this, people will complain about other teams maybe cheating or what have you. But the moment their team gets like someone who cheated on there, they'll defend it until their death.
Yep. Right.
And it's like, wait a minute, I thought you were for the purity of the sport, the game. When it's like, oh no, well, excuse and rationalize because now the cheating is on my group. So I'm going to protect my group because it's part of our identity. So, the advice I give is like, we can like something, love it, but don't marry it. Yeah. Make sure there's enough space between you and the groups that you're a part of. And the best way to figure that out is pay attention to the sensations and the feelings that you have as your group succeeds or it fails. And if you're feeling overwhelming by something, then that's a sign, hey, I got to step back. This is a little bit too important in my life, and I've got to create a little bit of space here.
And as you're describing that, I'm picturing almost like bubbles or circles. And as the important circles get influenced by my cheering for my CSU Rams, that's a sign. Like my marriage should not be influenced by the Rams. My relationship with my kids should not be influenced unless it's in a good way of having time with them at tailgates and that kind of stuff. That's a different question. My health should not be influenced. My sleep should not be influenced. Those are signs to us. If it's bumping up against the things that are truly important, we've fused instead of simply connected.
Right. It's the way I like to say it is it takes over your life. Yeah. Right. And you see this again, there's tons of examples, but for instance, your diet, if you like a diet, great. But if it starts intruding every other aspect of your life, where now, it's impacting your relationship with longtime friends because they eat a different diet and you're judging them or whatever have you, that's a sign because it's intruding on things that are important to you, that you value for a long time. And it's like encroaching and taking over. That's the sign where it's like, okay, I can still follow this diet, right? But it doesn't have to be my entire identity.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's hit the three things that you built the book around. B, which is clarity on who you are. Do, clarity in your pursuits. And belong, clarity in where and how you fit in. This obviously overlaps some of the things we've been talking about. You just turned 40 last fall, if I did my math right. I'll be 60 in about 18 months. Would your guidance on these vary based on phase of life, like a 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 plus? Any thoughts along? And obviously I've made those numbers up. I'm a big proponent of age really doesn't matter. That's not the key indicator. But just for sake of conversation, would you have any general shifts as you look at different phases of life?
Absolutely. I mean, let's take B, like clarity on who you are. Okay. to get that clarity, what do we have to do? We have to experience the world, right? We have to do real things in the real world with real people, sometimes mess up, right? To figure out what our values are, what actually matters, and where we want to go. This also goes with the pursuits we want to take down. When we're young, we shouldn't expect someone to have it all figured out because they don't have that experience to integrate and learn and knowledge. So when we're young, we're gonna need more what I call like room for exploration, to try to dabble, to follow different interests and be able to, explore, then let go and try on a different hat or try on a different path and see where we are. When we're younger, or when we're older, we're still going to need some exploration, right? Because that stokes that intrinsic motivation. It stokes that curiosity. It kind of keeps us young. But on the other side, we've got this hopefully this sense of security of a lifetime of wisdom. And we need to pull into that in the sense of, hey, this is what I know. This is how I can contribute. This is a large part of who I am. And even as I'm exploring these other areas, I'm going to bring this with me. So I think when we look at our different phases of life, to me, it's not saying I need to know exactly who I am, when I'm a 20-year-old or 22-year-old coming right out of college. This is what it's all about. And at 60, I know exactly who I am. So I'm going to stop exploring the world. I think at every different phase of our life, we need to be able to have this balance of like, in the book, I call it exploration versus commitment, right? We don't want to go all the way and be committed so much that we're no longer like, reading new books, trying new things, exploring the world. On the flip side, we don't want to be all the way in exploration mode where there's no sense of security. There's no sense of values or ethics or morals or things that are important to us that we can kind of come back to when we hit one of those struggle points where it's like, I'm exploring this, but like, I don't know if this really reflects where I want to go. So as we go through different phases of life, to me, it's kind of like you need to like look the other way and like turn around and just like check. It's like when I'm young, I'm exploring a lot. But does this reflect who I am? When you're old, it's like I'm really good at what I do. I have a lot of wisdom in this area. But am I missing out on something where I need to just kind of go dabble over here and get a little uncomfortable?
Well, and I think you bring up a good point. As you move into that maybe second half of life, you get comfortable in what you think you know, but the world changes daily. Like the world that we are in now is nothing like the world that I went to school in, and it's nothing like the world that'll exist in 20 years. How might someone who is shrinking their world, I think what happens a lot of times for the 60 and over group or even 50 and over is we start to shrink our world because we know you actually don't have a clue, but you want to tell yourself and you've got the patterns and it's working and it's worked up to this point. And so you shrink down, you stop reading, you stop exploring, you get in your routines. How do you break out of that? You talk about the exploration phase. I'm going to pull us back into that later, but while we're on it, let's run with it. How do you keep the exploration going when you get comfortable, when you get in a good, in quotes, rhythm, et cetera, et cetera? So it's working, and yet it's shutting us down simultaneously.
So this is a great point. And this is, as you said, I turned 40, but I struggle with this at times. For instance, AI, like it's mind blowing to me. And I was in my teens and early 20s when the internet started taking off, and that was prime time for, hey, this is crazy. I'm going to explore it because I'm young and I can do that. Right. And I think we're in this other phase and I can see it. I'm like, oh, this is like, 1999 where the internet takes off. But now, because it's 20 plus years later, I'm like, there's part of me that's like, but I do pretty well without AI. Right. do I really want to understand this? Do I really want to figure out how to use this? Or is it easier to just kind of be like, oh, that's hogwash. Like you don't need that stuff. And that pull to just like stick with the comfortable is there.
Strong.
And I think it's very strong. And I think what we have to do as we're old is kind of, again, rig our environment and rig our world to give us places where we can explore. So the way I've kind of done this is I've designated what I call them like down the rabbit hole days, where maybe a couple times a month, I just say, hey, this Friday is a down the rabbit hole day. And what that means is I take a topic or something that has caught my interest in the weeks before or months before that I don't know a lot about, that I'm just going to spend an afternoon and just, click down the rabbit hole. Maybe it's AI. I'm going to experiment with, Chat GPT and just go ham for 3 hours and try and figure it out. Maybe it's on a topic in a, area that I don't know much about, right? Maybe it's something sparked my interest in some historical context, and I'm going to go read about history. And I think the important part here is I'm not doing this for an outcome or objective state. I'm not saying I'm going to go learn Chat GPT so that I can use it in my books or learn about this history so I can tell this anecdote. No, down the rabbit hole days are essentially like play for an adult who's interested in things. And that forces me, again, to kind of adopt that beginner mindset and say, hey, I don't know much about this, but for the next couple hours, we're going to figure it out. And I think the more we can do that in our life, the better off we are. And then the other part that I think is really important, and this is something, honestly, that I know you do very well, is often exploration and breaking us free comes from conversation.
Yeah.
So surrounding yourself and having conversation with people who have different interests,
yes,
maybe even different age groups,
totally,
who can spark like that curiosity, because that's all we're trying to do is spark that curiosity that we had when we're young, where it's like, it's like I have a toddler, daughter, and I just watch her and you can see it. She sees a new thing or toy or something she hasn't played with before. And she's like, how does this work? And you can see her try and figure it out, and she'll dabble with it. And often until she figures it out or until she gets frustrated after a while and then moves on to the next. But I think as adults, we sometimes like hear that curiosity and then we just squash it.
Yeah.
And my kind of commanding voice is when I have conversations with people like you, Brad, is after this, I'll spend a couple minutes and be like, that was a really good insight or question that Brad had. I'm going to write that down. And I just throw it in a notebook. And then at some point I come back to that notebook and I'm like, okay, like time to explore some of these ideas.
I love that. And from an outsider's view, you seem to absorb so much information, or at least the way you're able to present it with not just your writing, but your stuff on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it these days. So it's working. I've got a quick tip for folks about those conversations. If you don't have a chance to do what Steve and I were doing, when I first moved to Fort Collins, I would just reach out to folks on LinkedIn that lived up here and say, you seem like a really interesting person. I have nothing to sell you. I'm not selling insurance. I'm not selling coaching, nothing. I'm just curious. You seem interesting. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? And folks, you'd be stunned. Like I sat down with the former mayor. Like people, when you say you seem like an interesting person, they're like, oh, well, thank you very much. Like we all want to be interesting people, right? So anyway, that might be something for some of you to follow through on. You distinguish between acting courageously and being courageous. Walk us through that. I get it because you explained it well in the book, but it seems like there's an interesting differentiation happening there.
Yeah, the way I would describe it is when we look at acting courageous, we often see that as the courage moment. We say, look what this person did. And I think that's important. But in my own life and my own research, I found that like that doesn't quite matter as much because it's a singular moment, right? It's and sometimes we get lucky. It's a singular moment where we do something, and then we look back and we're like, "Oh yeah, that was pretty courageous." I don't know how I got to that point
accidentally.
Right?
Yeah,
it's accidentally, and I think being is the stronger version of that, where we kind of encompass what it means to be able to be in those situations, and then have the ability, wherewithal, and the foundation in order to navigate them, no matter what comes up. So this is where it comes to things like holding true or holding on to your values. Being courageous, you need values. You need those things to kind of reflect on and say, hey, this is what I stand for. This is what matters. When you just go through the acting stage, you can get away with doing something that is courageous without reflecting or holding on to those values or even having it aligned with you. So I think to me, the transition point is like, how do we make this thing that is important a central part of our life, not only in specific situations, but across the board where we can kind of apply it, no matter whether it's at work, whether it's at home, whether it's in our sporting lives.
So many folks don't know that you were involved as the whistleblower for the Nike project and Salazar and all that stuff. So you've lived this, folks. This is not something he read an article about. This is not something that he sat down with somebody because they were interesting and they told him about being courageous. Steve's lived this. And as you will learn from the book, it wasn't a 6-week thing. It was basically a 10-year from what I remember. People are listening, and we all are facing something in our life that requires us to be courageous and not just act courageous. Could you, building on what you've absorbed from the last 10 years of experience of constant ups and downs, could you walk us through maybe some things to consider with whatever it is that we're about to face or that we're in the midst of or that we've dipped our toe into, but now we're having second thoughts about maybe I shouldn't have done that thing or stepped into that or said something or written that thing or whatever. Could just walk us through that a little bit, because everybody's got their courageous opportunity that they're either facing or they've already stepped into or they said no to, and now they're thinking, well, maybe I should step back in. So let's just walk down that path a little bit.
Yeah. Number one, I think, is the people around you really matter. As we often think of courage as this like singular defined, like I'm a courageous person.
Yes.
But it's the people around you. If you don't have that support group, if you don't have those who are willing to go on that journey with you and help you navigate those highs and lows, it's going to be a very long journey. So you need those people. And it's not just support, it's also perspective. And sometimes you're going to listen to that perspective, and sometimes you're going to note that perspective and say, okay, I appreciate that. That made me think, but I'm still going to go in this direction. And that's fine. But you need people to provide that perspective. The second part that I think is really important here is that whenever you do something, for me, whistleblowing, for others, just, that big decision, again, it comes back to, it can often take over our life.
Yes.
Where it becomes the thing that's like just sometimes haunting us, sometimes defining us, sometimes always there in the background. And what happens, we mentioned survival mode at the beginning, is when that thing is always in our life, we often tend to like kind of narrow and self-define ourselves around that thing. And then we go on that, as we talked about identity fusion with groups, the same thing happens when we're looking at, our courageous act or our whistleblowing or what have you. We fuse with the thing. So we go on the roller coaster ride of highs and lows with it impacting us. What I had to learn, and I made this mistake many times, is that you've got to keep your complexity about you to realize that, like, yeah, I blew a whistle. That was important in my life. But, I'm also married. Now I have kids. I have friends, family. I have other pursuits. I love running and athletic pursuits. I also love writing. I love talking to people about interesting things and science and research and, all of these different aspects of my life. I'm a complex human being, as we all are. And we need to lean into that complexity a little bit when something is causing us to narrow, because there was this fascinating research I came across by Robert Sapolsky, famed neuroscientist, written some excellent books. But he gave this example and he said, what most people don't realize is that our kind of like status or significance is often substitutable. And the example he gave is that, if you're struggling in your 9-to-5 job, but you are the hero on the company softball team, guess what? Your struggle, you will not feel your struggle in the 9-to-5 job as much. It still will suck. But you have this other thing that is providing you at least a temporary boost of like, my coworkers like me, I'm contributing, even if it sounds absurd. And there's research behind this that shows that if we looked at stress hormones like cortisol, you won't get as big of a hit of, cortisol if you lose at something, if you have something else in your life that is providing you and supporting you up. So that's where I think, again, we come back to that support. It's not just people, it's also other pursuits. The other example I'll give you real quick, and I didn't learn from this, but I remember when I was, I had to be 19 or 20 years old, in the prime of my running career. I got to spend this time with a world-class sports psychologist who'd worked with Olympians and medalists and professional baseball players and all sorts of people. And he told me the story. He said, "Hey, do you know this athlete?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely." And it was a world-class female runner, one of the best in the world. And he said, you notice how for a couple of years she struggled. And then in the last year or two, she's been doing well. And I said, "Yeah, she's really taken off." He said, "Yeah, do you know what the secret was? You know what helped her, get over that ups and downs earlier?" I said, "No idea." And he said, "Knitting." And 19-year-old me looked at him like he was crazy. He was like, "Knitting?" He said, "Yeah, I told her, you're great at running, but like, you got to have something else in your life." So she took up all these hobbies and then found she loved knitting, and then found a knitting group to be a part of so that, once the workout was done, she'd go hang out with her knitting friends and they knit things. And he said her performance took off after that. Wow. And 19-year-old Steve didn't quite grasp that concept, but 40-year-old Steve is looking back and he's like, this is genius. Because again, you might think is kind of lame, but again, there's research on this. When researchers looked at Nobel Prize winning scientists and then compared them to scientists like a rung or two below, they found that Nobel Prize winning scientists.
Fascinating. So fascinating. Yes. To finish your sentence. Sorry, I read it. They didn't. Keep going. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
They had more hobbies. They were more likely to, join a group or sing or dance or perform in the community theater than the rung or two below were just single-minded focused and didn't have those hobbies. And sometimes we give trite advice to this of like, oh yeah, diversify yourself, do things. But the evidence is there. And one of the reasons it works is it not only keeps us from being like single-minded focused and exhausting ourselves, but it also gives us an outlet where it's like, hey, if I'm struggling at work, guess what? I still need to go, knit that sweatshirt with my best friend knitting buddies, and that'll take some of the pressure off for a while.
That is 100% true. And I was looking for, as you were walking through that, I'm curious if you feel like you've fully gotten there, because the comment I'm looking for is you said something about, little did I realize that I would be known for this for the rest of my life, or someone told you be prepared to be known for this for the rest of your life. And you kind of, the way I read it, Steve, said, I guess I will be. And I literally wrote no with an exclamation point. That's not how you're known. You're known for this incredible resource that you continually provide people that are wanting to improve their lives. And yet I get the sense, maybe we can flip it to now Steve's confession time. I get the sense you're not there yet.
I'm not. I mean, you're very perceptive. And I think this is one of the big things I try and do with my writing, and hopefully it came across in this book, is I try to be honest with the readers. That was a big part of my life. And I'm in a much better place than I ever have been at any point. But it's still there to a degree. And I think we write the books that we need. And part of me writing this book is not saying like, hey, here's the path, I have it all figured out. It's saying, here's the journey that I've been on and what I've found and what has helped me. And I'm still working on it. So absolutely, logically, I know that you're right in the sense that, my writing and this sharing of information has eclipsed, whatever I did whistleblowing in terms of stuff. But there's still that feeling, right, that is there that like says, no, this is it. Like, define yourself in this way. And I think that's why, when we look at these things, it's not like, oh, I got it figured out. Like, look at me, I'm this complex human being and I can put this here and make it all make sense and stuff. No, it's always a journey. And part of life is just saying, hey, like, let's go on it. And I'm going to do my best to navigate it and learn from it and grow from it as we can, but it's never going to be perfect.
Yeah, it reminds me, we had Dr. Kelly McGonigal from Stanford on, and she said she reminded us, it's not unique to her, but she reminded us research is usually me search. And you're seeing the same thing about writing a book, it's what we need. I love that. All right, well, that brings us to the close of this first part of the interview. I tried to find a natural break point in this. He just had so much to share. And it just keeps getting better and better and better. So we will be releasing part 2 in our next episode. I hope you have a chance to come back and join us there. We cover everything from the whole concept of lowering the bar while raising the floor, a concept that initially was incredibly confusing to me and has ended up having an incredible impact on my own life personally. He talks about the scale of striving to obsess and how you can tell where you are on that plane. He even talks a little bit about what's next in the life of Steve Magness. So hope you can come back and join us for that second one. Really appreciate you being part of this podcast. We only grow because of you. We really do no marketing. Everything is organic. So any growth we're seeing is a tribute to you as our listeners, and we appreciate you sharing it with other folks. As always, feel free to reach out to us with any questions about your current or future coaching career. Emails results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or you can visit the website, catalystcoachinginstitute.com, for a whole bunch of health, wellness, and performance resources that may be of help. And now, it's time to be a catalyst. This is Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching. I will speak with you soon on another episode of the Coaching Lab podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.